You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Please join us at the Open Door. We discuss solidarity, subsidiarity, economic democracy, and nonviolence in light of Catholic social teaching. We explore how to move from discussion to political change. Culture and politics, to be sure, are interwoven, so we care deeply about education and the arts. Our questions often lead us to report on the projects and promise of the American Solidarity Party.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Valerie Niemeyer and Christopher Zehnder. Today we discuss the multifaceted issue of immigration. How can we better understand the new waves of immigrants, whether in Europe or the United States? What does the Church teach about the ethical issues that come into play? How can we assess the politics of immigration? What role should our parishes play, and how might we respond at a personal level? Our special and welcome guest is Father Piotr Mazurkiewicz. He is a professor of political science and Catholic social thought at Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski University in Warsaw, as well as editor-in-chief of the journal Christianity, World, Politics. From 2008 till 2012, he served as Secretary General of the Commission of Bishops of the European Community. Father recently authored Two Towers and a Minaret, Migration from Catholic Perspective, En route Books, 2024. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, please tell us how you came to your work on the multifaceted question of immigration.
You see, as I am a Catholic priest and on the other hand, social scientist, so in this my scientific research, I always try to accompany the Church in different challenges the Church is facing. I started with the time of transition from the communist to democracy, then with European integration and how the Church should approach this issue. After World Trade Center, I came to violence in politics and with reflection on terrorism and ethics. And after 2015, so after this wave of massive migration to Europe, I started to work on migration. And that's strictly linked with the fact that on the one hand, you have the facts, and you have real people, and on the other hand, you have politics. So there was a conflict of interest and so on. And the question is, what is morally good in this context? Because the Church should not just follow this or that political line, this or that program, but reflect on the morality on the moral approach to this issue. So I try to do this.
You said, on the other hand, you have politics. Can you fit politics on one hand?
If you see, formally, I am a political scientist. So when we are talking on politics, on the one hand, you have this Aristotelian approach, and I think the Church is following this line of reflection that politics is a part of ethics. So this is the care for the common good.
Well,
on the other hand, you have this Machiavellian approach that this is only on power.
Here in the United States, politics won't sit on one hand or two hands. It spreads everywhere. Well,
that's
Christopher, can you take us forward?
Yes. I'm curious. Immigration is a big issue, as you probably know, in the American election. It's been a big issue now for as long as I can remember, but especially with the Republican side, they make it a very big issue. And we're treated with rhetoric that all migrants are, or a huge number of them are very dangerous people. I'm not as familiar with what's happening in Europe, but what would you say would be, how is migration, the whole migration issue, differ in Europe as from the United States? What are the commonalities? What are the things? How do they differ?
You see, it is somewhat different, but at the same time, I think what is in common is this massive character. So the challenge for us is not just migration, but the massive migration. Because always in human history, we were on the move as people. And the measure of this massive migration exceeds the capacity to integrate migrants. And here is the question of political and ethical responsibility. So how many people you can integrate into your society, not provoking a big risk, for example, of open conflicts, as we have seen recently in England and so on. On the other hand, the challenge is strictly linked with this high homogeneity. So that when we reflect on Europe, before 2014, there was a dominance of Muslims, but also a high percentage of Christians among migrants. Also due to the persecutions of Christians in the Middle East and so on. And then this was changed, and it's clear that mostly we are talking in Europe on Muslim migration to Europe. So in the US, I think that's mostly migration from Latin America, means Spanish-speaking people, mostly Catholics, and mostly, probably also as in Europe, these are young men. In Europe, we can say in draft age. So in this context, we can say due to this homogeneity, the massive migration with time is changing also our culture, the structure of society. In Europe, in a certain sense, it is forbidden to talk about religion in this migration process. But in my understanding, that's a very important factor. Also, because in the migration process is very important for the integration of migrants, the cultural distance. So not the geographical one, but how close is the culture of newcomers to the culture of the country which is hosting them, and to what extent the people would like to become a member of the hosting societies. I think one of the mistakes is that we sometimes in debates we are looking on migration from an individual perspective. So if always the policy would be on single people. But when we are talking about massive migration, we are very conscious that these are communities which are on the move. So that people are moving from one village in one country, and they are forming a quarter taking a quarter in a big city somewhere in Europe or in the West, they are not just dispersed all over the country. So in Europe, we have cities where since more than 10 years, the majority of inhabitants are Muslims, like Rotterdam, for example. In the former time, because that's also natural for human beings, we would like to live among people who are like we. So, for example, in Chicago was in the former time the second biggest Polish city in the world after Warsaw. I think it's not the case today. But this means that people were forming also a kind of ghetto in this new country. And with the development of new technologies, we are talking about diasporas. So it means that the community which settled down somewhere in the US or in Europe, but they have the feeling that they are still a part of the society in their own nation state. And on the one hand, it's quite easy to take a cheap flight, and they are going for holidays and so on back. On the other hand, you have social media, you have national access to national TV and so on. So there's so many factors which would push us to integrate in this new country, to really wish to be like on the people in the neighborhood. I think that's very important, and also what is important is the average age of migrants, because in my understanding, one of the most important incentives for migration is demographic crisis on the West. In Europe, that's very sharp. So that the average age of migrants is much lower than of Western societies. This means also that the mortality rate is lower and the fertility rate is higher in these groups. So we see that this process of a change in the societies provoked by migration can accelerate in the future. And we should just consider that the first thing I think is to understand the phenomenon and then to reflect how we should react to this.
So is it, I would guess too that for Europe, immigration means something different from us, from the United States. So in the United States, we've had this historically predominant Anglo-Protestant culture, Scots-Irish Protestant culture. But we've always held the idea of our country being a melting pot. So it's supposed to bring in, where we sort of more or less expect that people from other cultures are going to come and live here. To be an American, is to become an American citizen. It's to be naturalized. And it doesn't really carry with it necessarily, or hasn't always carried with it, the notion that you become a certain culture or a certain nationality. But in Europe, I mean, some years ago, I remember hearing about a German who did a suicide bombing in Israel. And I thought, what was a German doing a suicide bombing in Israel? Well, it turns out the German was actually a Mideasterner, but he's called a German because he's a German citizen. That makes sense with the United States. Doesn't make as much sense, it seems to me, with Europe. Is that so? You have this other aspect where if you're a German, that has a meaning over and above what constitutional order you're living under. It would seem to me that would create further difficulties than what we have here.
Yes, so certainly there is a huge difference. So you see, when I had lectures in the US, my students, all of my students had migration background in previous generation or somewhere in the past. So, and that's characteristic of American society. I think that this, from this point of view, is also very natural not to have just a negative approach to migration as such, but to uncontrolled migration. And in the US, in the former time, you, for example, had some quotas for different nation, for different direction from which you were ready to receive migrants. Because, for example, you were afraid in a certain time of Chinese massive migration to the US. In Europe, but that's mostly our intellectual perception, that we are thinking that we had homogeneous nations. We have to say we have, and this is a European experience, this historical nations, but especially in my country, we never were homogeneous because Poland was on the border of civilizations. So that the border is not just strict, that no one can pass from one side of the river to the other one. And on the other hand, also in Poland, for example, we had there was a Polish Commonwealth, a country of 3 nations plus Jews, which form about 10% of the society. For this reason, we had 4 national parliaments, and then the parliament of the country. And then we had also other minorities, like German one or Armenian one, or we, since 600 years, we have Tatars, so the Muslim community, which was invited to Poland to protect Polish eastern border. And after this 600 years, we can say they are very well integrated. But at the same time, they behave like Christians, being Muslims. So that this transformed also their understanding of Islam with centuries. But this is, I think, an important experience also for other countries, that on the one hand, Islam, social political concepts linked with Islam are totally different than this associated with Christianity, especially because there is no concept of a church as a separate from politics institution. And on the other hand, that the people, regardless their religion, so they can accommodate. But this is taking time. But also, if this is not on small groups, but on large groups, so they are changing the hosting country, the culture, maybe the language. Also, we have also some, for example, Jewish words in Polish language or German and so on. And on the other hand, this can also change political culture. So that one of my friends, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he made a research. So how developed the political systems in those post-communist countries? The conclusion was that all the countries with the society dominated by Western Christianity became democratic. With Orthodoxy, there was a mixture, because we had, for example, we have Bulgaria, Romania, which are in the EU, in NATO, and so on. We have Ukraine, which was, in a certain sense, in the middle for a quite long time. And then we have Belarus and Russia. When we approach the Muslim countries, any is democratic. So we can see just in this case that religion and this tradition, this political tradition, which is somehow linked with religion, is playing a role. So the question is also how our political systems can be changed by massive migration.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, Valerie.
Yes, Father. Wow, you're really helping us open up so many dimensions of the issue that we so often aren't thinking of. Thank you. Help us to understand just the concept of national sovereignty. What's national sovereignty? What is it founded on? And what are the limits that we can understand it national sovereignty would have?
I think we should start with the origins of this concept. So a French thinker, Jean Baudin, in the 16th century, he was proud that he elaborated the concept of sovereignty for the first time, even if the word was used before in the Middle Age, but in a totally different sense. Mm-hmm. And why he treated the concept of sovereignty as absolutely necessary? Because he wanted to justify absolute power. So for the absolutist system. And for this reason, for us Christians, that's a tricky term. We are using this concept also because it's in the international law and so on, but trying to avoid this trap of the absolute power. It means that when we are talking about the sovereign power, we are saying, yeah, there are some limits of competences, so that the government cannot do anything they want. And we will say here, I think especially in the US, but also in our Polish democratic tradition, there is a constitution. And there are limits in the constitution inscribed. But in the constitution means also in the system. That like James Madison, who said, if people would be angels, there would be no need of a government. If angels would govern people, there would be no need for control mechanism, for check and balances mechanism. So, but they are already in our Western constitutions. But at the same time, and I think the German case with the Weimar Constitution here is very important, that the democratic country with the democratic constitution historically could switch into a totalitarian system without any visible break in politics. So that we know that the culture is necessary, this democratic culture, and but just concerning the sovereignty concept, this concept is saying that the state is entitled to the highest possible level of autonomy. That the states are equal in international relations, formally equal. because in practice, we see that the power of different states are different. And what is also important that the state authority has a default competence in internal affairs. So if, for example, there's a new issue which should be regulated, like data protection, artificial intelligence, or pandemic, and we say, who has the right to regulate this? Who should issue the law? We are saying, yes, sovereign power. But you can say from this ethical point of view, the sovereign power is obliged to respect, for example, the human rights not only of citizens but also of residents. So that here in this human dignity we are equal, even if we are not citizens. This means also that in extreme situation, also from the international law point of view, there's a possibility of humanitarian intervention to protect the citizens in front of their own government. And I think also, maybe especially in the American context, we are very conscious that this institution should not be abused. So that's an extreme institution to intervene in such a way. In the context of migration, I think what is important is that the government is responsible for migration policy. So that the decision how the migration process is organized should be taken by this sovereign power, not by another country, not by international community, but by the state. And here we can say that that's also from moral point of view, the state should have a migration policy. In this, they are invited by the church to accept migrants, but conditionally, as far as this is possible. So the church is saying there are limits also. We don't expect that the country will do something which will be irrational, will destroy the society, will provoke conflicts, because this sovereign government is primarily responsible for its own citizens. And this is a part of Catholic theology. There is an order of charity. So that when we are saying what we first we are responsible, so we start with, for example, the family, and the circle are growing. But this means also that the government should try to maintain the living standards of the citizens, that to ensure security, social peace, but also to protect national identity, cultural continuity of the community. So that with this, I think what is specific is that if someone is thinking that the national identity, also in this political identity in the US, that this is a closed concept, so that Americans should always be like today, he's wrong, because the culture is something living, so it's changing, but at the same time, we expect that there will be a continuity, and that we can decide what is fitting to our culture and what is contrary to it.
there's a library in this, not just a book. There's a library in this.
Mm-hmm.
A couple thoughts that I have. First of all, with sovereignty, some of us on this program, one of us in particular, are students of Jacques Maritain. And Maritain was sharply critical of what national sovereignty has come to be seen as. And A Man in the State, he too begins with a discussion of Baudin. And it's very interesting that we have this dispute about national sovereignty. I think that what the church teaches about national sovereignty is not what any nationally sovereign state would teach about itself. And I think that the differences between the two views are often papered over. And that brings us to Maritain's view of the state as the topmost agency of the people, At any rate, there certainly is a role for the state, and there is a role for the state in determining policy with regard to migration. And yet, when I think of things at a more personal level, I find myself, my wife and I find myself very often ignoring what the state teaches about immigration. For example, we have someone who is vital to our household, a caregiver for my brother who suffers from dementia, and she's not here legally. And there are a fair number of Americans, I imagine, who would not hire her on those grounds. And there are a small number of Americans, I imagine, who would just as soon report the fact that we employ her. But we have every intention of continuing to employ her. And we think that the policy set by the state is simply wrong-headed. And we're not going to pursue that, and we're not particularly impressed by it either. Now, there is also, and you point this out again and again in your splendid book, so many differences in different regions with respect to immigration. Here in Los Angeles, your background things, while this is saying it in a broad brush way, Anglos, and I count as an Anglo because I'm Dutch, Anglos pretty much stole California. and they pretty much got away with stealing California. And now in Los Angeles, once again, the majority of the population is Latino. And it's going to continue that way. And there isn't any cultural rupture because the culture was pretty much that way anyway, except the suppression, really, of Latinos by far more wealthy oil industries led to a period in which Anglos deported Latinos who, in fact, had become citizens. They deported them anyway. So there's this incredible hodgepodge. Now, it is the case that we have to think of things, and I certainly respect this, we have to think of things in a communitarian way. But communities don't go to heaven or don't go to hell. Individuals go to heaven, individuals go to hell. And when I think of things from the individual level, personal level, it seems to me that I have a right to leave the country, and that I also have a right, prima facie right, to stay in the country. The American political philosopher who's been so enormously influential, John Rawls, liked to draw a distinction between voluntary organizations and the state. It seems to me at a fundamental level, the state is also a voluntary organization. I don't have to stay here, I don't think, if I don't want to. I should have good reasons for leaving because it causes all sorts of connections with other people to be impacted. But also, it seems like none of us are mere creatures of the state. If I wanted to immigrate to Poland, it seems to me that I ought to be able to. And the same for people in Poland ought to be able to immigrate here. You mentioned your students having background as immigrants when you were in the United States. I grew up in a place called Grand Rapids, Michigan. And half the town was Polish and half the town was Dutch.
Mm.
Yeah, that's just the way it was. And we certainly had contacts with the Netherlands, and the Polish people certainly had contact with Poland. At any rate, that was not a library, that was not a book, that was what we call here a rant. And if you'd like to comment on the rant at any point, you are most cordially invited to do so.
Yes, you see, when I'm talking about this fact that there are communities on the move, that's just a social fact. And a different thing is the question of individual responsibility of citizens, in this sense that the government is taking decision that if the US would like to accept 100,000 immigrants a year or 1 million. That's not your personal decision, but you are voting for this or that government. This political decision concerning the directions from which immigrants are welcomed and so on, how to react on the phenomenon. That's the policy. But when you are meeting a person with immigrant background, that's you personally. So in this case, that's also a question of moral obligation, my moral obligation to this concrete person. And here we are not replaced by the government. It might be that there is someone who is illegal migrant. So from the point of view of the state, shouldn't be here. But he is, and he is sick. And you are like a Samaritan passing by. So you don't ask who the person is. But on this background, it's impossible to construct the state policy. But we would like that citizens would be like good Samaritans. It's true that every person has a natural right to leave its own country. I was born in a communist state, and we were deprived of this right. So we should apply for a passport, and the answer, simplifying, depends on what is our approach to the communism. If you are against, you will not receive. If you decide to cooperate with them, the passport was delivered. And this is over this time. So citizens are not the prisoners of the state. Quite recently, I heard a similar message on a meeting with a Turkish minister who said Turkey is a country that the government decides who has the right to enter and who has the right to leave the country. That's my experience from the past. Today, everyone has his own passport at home and is free to go where he wish. But it doesn't mean that everyone has the right to settle down anywhere. Because the land is not empty. So we can say, using this word, that the land is occupied so that the owners, there is a hosting community. And this community should have accept us if you would like to settle down there and to become a member of this community. This is like just when someone would like to enter your home. You are the host, so you decide under which condition, for how long, and so on. So we as Catholics were invited to hospitality. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that at home the role of guest and host should be changed today. And that's the question of rationality, of responsibility, and so on. But in such a case, when we are talking about an appointment with a concrete person, our moral responsibility is individual. We can be in very different situations. I remember my Italian friends. They had, I think, 4 children, and the day this couple came to me with the children and one black child on her hand. I was surprised because they were white, and how it came that they have a black child. And I said, in the morning in Milan, I has gone for a newspaper, and I found on the street in a newspaper a baby. So I informed the police. We filled all the documents, but the question was, but what to do now with this baby? And it's a very nice story on marital love. Because he said, in this moment, I started to reflect what my wife would do. And he said, my wife would adopt this child. So I took the child, and my wife reacted exactly that way. And that came to me with this child. I don't think that every one of you will have a similar story. But this responsibility is always very concrete. And on the other hand, when we are talking about the right to leave the country, just when you will see also the statistics, more than 97% of humanity is living in the country of origin. It means much more natural for a person is not to migrate, but to stay home. Because this is my city, I was born here, that's my church, my school, that's this. Here are the tombs of members of my family, and so on. It's important that I can go to the cemetery and I see not only the tomb of my father, but grandfather, great-grandfather, and I'm rooted here. It's really my place, and that's the natural experience of people. So we have to say that this right to stay home is much more natural for a person then this right to leave the country, even if everyone should be free to leave. And that here, when we are thinking about the right to leave the country and to the right to stay in the communist country, from time to time, people were forced to emigrate, if they were troublesome for the government, and they were deprived of citizenship. So we will say, no, it shouldn't be like this. You have your own country, your own place, and you have the right to stay there. And then we can reflect, but if a group of people, quite large, is leaving the country, is migrating, so what for? You have a separate phenomenon concerning the refugees, because these are people who are forced to leave the country. And when we are talking about refugees, also in the international law, they have a different status and a different rights. So we are talking about people who are forced to leave because, for example, their life was at risk, and who would like to come back. There's a right to return safely home. But for a certain moment, they need a shelter. We usually naturally see the distinction between one and the other group. So we are much more open, in a natural way, to those who suffer because they were deprived of their country, of their home, and so on. When we, for example, in the context of migration, we refer to the Holy Family, who left Palestine and settled down for a certain time in Egypt. They were not just immigrants. They were refugees. They never had idea to settle down forever, because the story of salvation would be stopped. This story which happened if Jesus wouldn't come back to Palestine. And on the other hand, when we are thinking about economic migrants, so they want, in general, to change their living standard. We can say everyone can have this wish to live, have better living conditions. But if we would like to grant them that they will be able to stay home, so we should invest there. And that's the question of development aid, not just just sham aid, that we really want that those poor countries, we are calling them developing countries today, that they really develop, and that we want that people will have the better living condition, also political standards and guarantees for the rights. So here we have the problem that sometimes trying to solve the issue of migration, we are using so-called end-of-pipe technology. So people are on the border. What to do with them? People are just on some ships on the Mediterranean Sea. What to do with them? But this is the end of the process. If we would like to change something, we should ask what is pushing them from their own country, what we can do there. not at the end of the pipe, but at the beginning. And I think that's the problem of real solidarity, in this sense that we wouldn't like that a country in Africa will live on a higher standard that in Germany people are living, or in the US. We would like just to help a little, but not too much, because there's a competition also on the market and in between the countries.
Spugit, sadly, how about if we use the last 5 minutes for a final thought from Christopher and a final thought from Valerie, and then we always end with the gospel for the day. So we're pushed for time. Christopher?
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties with the whole immigration question, at least in the United States, and probably analogous in Europe, is that when one's own government is responsible for policies that actually help impoverish other nations. You talk about, we look at things, we ask questions about what the beginning of the process of immigration. And I remember after the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed back in the 90s, that the rate of immigration from Latin America to the United States increased tremendously. It had always been there, but it increased tremendously. And some of the causes were the destruction of like certain Mexican industries, like farming, took a big hit because the United States government the Congress was subsidizing American agriculture production so they could sell their corn south of the border below market price. So you have this. So what we have now is we have people who protest immigrants coming from Latin America up into our country. But historically, much of that has been because actions our own government taken in our name. So it would seem like I think sometimes what we're not looking at is basic justice. Have we been acting justly to neighboring nations, especially when we have a country like the United States who's immensely powerful, and governments in Latin America, particularly Mexico and others, which are not. So that's something I think that's not coming into the equation often enough. It's not simply people coming up here who want to better their condition. It's people who often come up here because they have no other condition. They have hardly any condition to better down in their own native countries.
Thank you. Valerie?
Yes, I just see so many connections as you were talking. I'm thinking about capitalism and the free market, and I'm thinking about abortion and how we want to address the end game, the end situation, but we're not addressing the root causes. And, you just see that in this culture of, we can contribute to a culture of life, or we could contribute to a culture of death, but we must nurture at all levels a culture of life, not complain about, the results of kind of an apathy or a contribution to things that produce these problems. So, I think this is just really good food for thought, and I would just invite you to share your final thoughts that you would want people to think about.
You see, I think that on the one hand, the issue of justice is very important. But this means also of decent politicians. So that we need virtuous politicians, and they, in this moment, can lead organized just policy. On the other hand, on many issues, there's a problem of ideology. So that the government, you see that the change of the government and the total change of the policy, for example, on migration. Mm-hmm. And why? Because one group is sharing this ideology, and the other group, the other one. And the real responsibility, political responsibility, is linked with rationality. So we should try to really understand the problem and look for good solutions and what is serving the common good. When you are referring to the culture of death, that's the term which was probably coined by John Paul II, but in two different senses. Because one is just concerning the content. The concept carries, and the content destroys what is most human in humans, so that we are, in a certain sense, less human than we should be. On the other hand, that this culture massively inflicts death of innocent people. For abortion, for euthanasia, for experiments with human embryos, but might be that also a result of this culture can be death of some migrants. If we don't look at them as on people, if we don't respect their dignity, I think that's the question that in this Christian approach we are saying every human being has the same dignity and the same value, and then is the question what we can do to grant the best respect for this dignity for everyone, and then there are this order of love.
In a sense, what is the most humanizing thing that we can do in this concrete situation? And that dehumanized people tend to dehumanize one another. So we do have to tend, as you say, it is important to consider the culture, yes, and the continuity and the communal aspect. And it's hard to hold all these things in tension, but.
Yeah, but on the one hand, you can see that, for example, the far left is saying the more migrants, the better, because they are saying this multicultural society is better, of a better quality than homogeneous one. So we should destroy the homogeneity of the society. But on the far right, you can see that sometimes a very negative approach to migration, also dehumanizing people. So that there is not only a fear because we don't know what will happen, but also because we don't respect the dignity of others. And that's also risky.
We sadly come to the end, and coming to the end, we come for us to the beginning, the gospel for today. Jesus told his disciples this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out at dawn to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with them for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. Going out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You too go into my vineyard, and I will give you what is just." So they went off. And he went out again around noon and around 3 o'clock and did likewise. Going out about 5 o'clock, he found others standing around and said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They answered, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You too go into my vineyard." When it was evening, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Summon the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and ending with the first." When those who had started about 5 o'clock came, each received the usual daily wage. So when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also got the usual wage. And on receiving it, they grumbled. They grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last ones worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who bore the day's burden and the heat." He said to one of them in reply, "My friend, I am not cheating you. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what is yours and go. What if I wish to give this last one the same as you? Or am I not free to do as I wish with my own money? Are you envious because I am generous? Thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last. Come, Lord Jesus, come." Thank you so much, Father. We immensely appreciate your giving us this time.
Thank you very much for the talk.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.